Welcome to PhotoActive, a podcast about photography and technology. I'm Kirk McElhone.
And I'm Jeff Carlson.
This week, we're very happy to have a return guest to our podcast, Michael Kenna. It's really good to talk to you again. We met last year in Bosham in southern England when you were there for an exhibit. And now you are holed up in a secluded location near Seattle.
Indeed. Good to see you again, Kirk. And hi, Jeff. How are you doing? Normally, I live in Seattle, but we have this little place in Port Townsend, which is just over 2 hours away. And basically since February, we've been holed up here. And it's rather nice, I must say. We're very close to the water. We can go for walks, bicycle rides, and we have some space around us.
It's very nice, but for someone like you who is always globetrotting, this must have been a big change.
It has. I haven't been anywhere since February.
Where had you planned to go this spring?
Oh, I can't even remember. All over the place. Many places.
Do you generally plan like a month here, a month there when you travel?
Yes. I was basically planned throughout the rest of the year from February onwards and just had to cancel. I mean, all the exhibition openings were canceled. All the book signings were canceled, lectures, everything. All my photographic expeditions were postponed. So it's life. It's a different existence for us all. It's not such a great sacrifice for me. At least I can still do some work. I can go back to my old negatives, for example, and wander around and see what there is. I mean, I'm very in a luxurious position insofar as I've worked for 45 years. I have this huge archive of negatives.
Thousands.
Yes, thousands and thousands. So it's literally been a creative process of coming up with projects based upon new and old work. Basically, new work meaning they're old photographs, but I've never printed them before.
Right. And so you've got a new book coming out that's already out here in the UK. It's called Buddha, and it's photos of Buddha statues from around the world. Jeff was asking me before we started recording, was it your idea to make a book of Buddha statues, or was it a publisher who said, well, you've got a lot of Buddha photos. Would you like to make a book?
I like to think, what is it? It takes a village to raise children, and it takes a village to make a book. So, in fact, it was a publisher's idea. Yes, I've had an interest in Buddhism, since I started going to Japan in the mid-'80s, and have photographed Buddhist statuary just because I've found it so magnetic, attractive, mysterious, esoteric, just different from my own background. And so I have this extensive collection of photographs of statuary. And I happened to be on a trip maybe a year ago, and I was emailing back to my publisher about another book. I can't remember, maybe it was the Holger book or the Rouge book or Beyond Architecture. We've published 4 books together, Prestel. And I just sent him some snaps of pictures I was doing at the time, and I was in some Asian country. And I think he said, maybe we should think about a book on the Buddha. Well, sometimes that's the way my projects, they come from nowhere. They come from a little email or just from an idea.
Well, you told me last year that, a French publisher had noticed that you have a lot of photos with birds. So he said, how about you make a selection of bird photos and make a book? Exactly.
The same thing. And my response to him, the bird publisher, was that, no, I really don't have enough photographs. I mean, I like birds, but I'm not really a bird photographer. And he said, well, we counted. You have 35 on your website. And so I went back through my 45 years of negatives and found another 100 images.
Yeah.
From which we edited back down to 40 or 50, whatever it is. Very recently, the same thing happened with an Israeli press. We were just chatting, and he said, you're English. We really should do a book about England someday. And I said, well, I was there in, the early 80s photographing specifically the wool and cotton towns in Lancashire and Yorkshire.
Yeah.
And I did some at the time, but, you continue on and your subject matter changes, your interests change. And so they've just been dormant for all these years. And I sent him a few samples and he said, yes, let's do it. So now I've been spending the last few weeks scanning those negatives so that we can choose the selection, and then in the winter I will probably print them, and then next year there'll be a publication on Yorkshire and Lancashire. I don't know what the Northern England, I don't know what the title will be, but it'll be a kind of a strange publication, but very interesting, I think, for me.
And you're from that part of the country?
Yes, it was a returning home. It was following Bill Brandt's great influence in the early 80s, because when I first started, I'm sure we discussed this, when I first started photography, I always thought photography was it should be beautiful and inspirational, and it's the landscape and trees, and then I kind of, after 6 or 7 years, I kind of came into this circle when I was back to my industrial roots, photographing power stations and cotton mills and and things like this, and old canals. And it was that first return in that first circle that we're concentrating the book on.
You're from the Northwest?
Yes,
Liverpool?
from Widnes, which is 12 miles from Liverpool.
Right.
Yeah, the local team was called the Chemics, rugby league team, because of the chemical factories. It was very industrial.
I saw last year Ian McKellen did a one-man show, and we went to see it in Stratford, and he's from around there, and he was talking about the industrial background. Of course, he left pretty quickly once he got into theater.
Yes.
But that whole northwestern area, for me, it's the Manchester music scene of the 80s. That's really magnetic. But that whole area seems a lot more creative than, I don't know, the Southeast or different parts of the UK. Again, I've only been here for 7 years, so I don't know well enough. But there are areas that seem to have that sort of creative personality.
It might have something to do with the climate.
Yeah.
You're indoors a lot. I don't know. I mean, I'm a product of basically Liverpool. Jerry and the Pacemakers and the Beatles and all this sort of the '60s. So yes, it's a hive of creativity around that area. But I think it's I live in Seattle now, which is home of indie music basically. It's just rife with creativity. But the climate here is very similar. It rains a lot. It's quite dark sometimes.
Yeah.
In winter, and I think it's conducive to creativity. You're not out, skiing or, swimming or snorkeling. You're kind of indoors using your creativity.
Although that's not very good for photography. You want to be outdoors for photography, and you have to deal with the weather when you're there. Is that why you left? No, it's a long story why you left. I know that. But it's true that in areas like that, photography tends to be, it fits with your work, the tones of black and white, the monochrome, doesn't it?
That's my home. That's where I come from. European influenced, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, but now it's fine. As long as there's an international airport close by, I could live anywhere.
So you said you're going back in the archives and looking at old photos. Do you have a lot of cat photos?
2 or 3. You never know. I might.
Yeah. See, I take a lot of photos of my cats.
You said you didn't have any bird photos and then turned out to find hundreds, so you never know.
But actually, a lot of your bird photos are interesting because there's one that's like 200, the title of the photo is, I think, 242 crows, that you actually count the number of birds in the photos.
Well, it's one of the hardest part of photography, I think, is to come up with titles. I could just say untitled study number 576, but...
Well, so some of your photos, you do that. So the Huangshan mountain photos, for instance, you say study number whatever.
Yes.
Why do you not title them? Because it's harder to give an identity to something that's just a picture of a mountain and trees?
Well, there is that, but I think you also give, for me at least, too many clues to the viewer. So if I say, mist in the mountains, whatever, it kind of already, seduces the viewer in a sense, in a certain direction. Whereas if I call it Huangshan Mountain Study 75, it's completely neutral. Yeah. So the person who comes to that image can bring their own background, experience. Some approach it from a mountaineering point of view. Some some are bird watchers, some are climbers. Everybody has their different perspective. And I quite like that I'm not influencing what people think or see in the images.
It's true, because once you give a title that contextualizes an image, right. And let's say you're giving a title that has something like morning dew, or a title that's like evening mist, and that's already putting a flavor around the image.
Yes. And sometimes I can't avoid doing some of that, but I try not to be completely overt about it. I try to be as neutral as possible. I might say, early in one, I might say night walk, because out walking, or Twickenham Bridge, or River Thames Reflection, or something. I try to make them very neutral and descriptive as much as possible. So yes, with birds, if you have 100 bird photographs,
yes.
lesser spotted.
You have to count them.
Whatever it is. I don't even know what the birds are most of the time, so it's...
So the Buddha book, I find this stunning, in part because I've been a student of Zen Buddhism for a dozen years, and I've been interested in Buddhism for about 30 years. I lived in Paris for many years, and I went to the Musée Guimet where you took some of the photos, and I remember appreciating the collection of statuary and all other art that they had in there. What I find interesting is that this book, in some ways, is two books in one. It's a book of your photography, but it's also a descriptive book about Buddhist iconography. In other words, since the table of contents is listed by country, that makes it almost a scholarly book that people can look at, even if they're not interested in the art of the photography.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. I don't have much comment on that. I mean, I found it difficult. It was a bit like the birds, that when the publisher said, you have all these photographs of Buddhas, and I said, yeah, I'll print them, or I'll scan them first, and then I'll print them all. And then I think, what am I going to do with these? I have 100, 200, 300 photographs of this statuary. How do I order it? And so I sought the help of the publisher to find an independent curator who could essentially assemble them, select
organize them.
Yes, I had no idea what I was doing. I found visually I was attracted, but I had not a clue in terms of historical, which were important, which weren't important, which were the true Buddhas and which were the derivative Buddhas. And it's a worldwide phenomenon, and it's very, very complicated.
It is because there's not just one Buddha. There's all sorts of Buddhas.
Exactly.
The Buddha Shakyamuni is the main dude, but then there's all the others. In fact, the cover is one of my favorite photos in the book is the Amida Buddha from Kamakura, which is this huge statue.
Yes.
Very imposing, and it's a specific position that's Japanese, and in other countries the Buddhist statues aren't the same positions. Right. You've got the hand positions that change according to which Buddha. It's very complicated.
It is, and we did decide to have a scholarly text at the beginning which explains some of this and the variations from country to country and a historical relevance to them also, much of which I don't completely understand.
Well, but you do now because you've read the introduction. But what's interesting is that you do see the grouping by country. The statues resemble the faces of the people in the country. So the Japanese statues look like Japanese people. The Thai statues look like Thai people, etc. Yes. And the way they're grouped together gives them a certain unity that you get beyond just the artistic nature of the photos.
Yes, and we included landscapes also to give more of a flavor of the country and how they associate with that particular country.
Well, I was going to get to that because what I find interesting is that it's not just a photo of Buddhas. You've interspersed other photos. I'm in China here. Here's Huangshan Mountain Studies 1. Here's a picture of a tree. One of my favorite pictures is on page 25. It is rock garden and roof shadow. I'll put a link in the show notes to the photo on Michael's website. It is this extraordinary geometric photo of, you see the gravel of the rock garden cutting diagonally across the frame. You see the shadow of the roof that is aligned with the diagonal. And I just love that chance moment that you discovered when the light was just perfectly lined up there. Is this one of these things where you saw it coming and you waited to get that shot?
I wish I could do that. I seem to have a lot of patience, but at the same time, I like to do what Gary Winogrand did and photograph to see what something is photographed. So I tend to explore. I'm constantly on the move. So something like this was a chance opportunity. Often I visit temples for half an hour, for an hour. I don't know this particular one. Which one? Where is it? It doesn't say where. Shikoku, yes. So it's 2012, isn't it? Yes. So it's a later visit. So I just look. I look around. I see what I see, and I take the opportunities. I did not set it up ahead of time. It was fortuitous circumstance that the sun was shining, and the sun was in a particular place, and I was standing there and spotted it.
Tell us about your pilgrimage, because in the back of the book, you explain how you got into this whole idea, and you did this pilgrimage of 88 temples, which apparently is a thing. It's kind of like the equivalent of the Compostela pilgrimage in Spain for the Japanese people?
Yes. Well, I was introduced to it a few years earlier by Mai Ishiwata, my agent in Japan. She took me to Shikoku, and I visited a few of the temples and found out about the pilgrimage, which is 88 temples based upon Kobo Daishi's journey a long time ago. And I just decided that this was a fun thing to do for my 50th birthday. Of course,
fun thing to do.
one is supposed to walk it, which takes 2 months to 6 months. I didn't have that time. Most of it I did by car. I would drive between temples, and I had a guide for some of it. But also in those days, GPS was such, you just put the telephone number of the temple and it would take you there. And so I would arrive. I had a book, and every temple you go into, somebody would do this beautiful calligraphy on a page, and with these vermilion stamps.
Yeah.
And so this wonderful book of this souvenirs of all 88 temples, and then later I went to Koyasan, the temple headquarters in Honshu, and had it stamped and written on them. And I worked out ahead of time how to do this heart mantra, which is takes maybe 2 or 3 minutes. And I just found that, as in most of my photography, I would go to the temple, I would pay my respects to the Buddha, I would say my prayers, I would ask permission to photograph, not of somebody, but just to the essence of the place. And then I would spend time photographing whatever I saw, such as the geometric shapes, temple roofs, Buddhist statuary, anything that I would find that made me inquisitive. Sometimes I would spend, 15, 20 minutes there. Some of the temples are very, very small, very simple, very humble. Some were in the mountains, and I would spend 4 or 5 hours, getting there and walking around and seeing what there was. So it was a very humbling, very exciting experience. They say that with these pilgrimages, it's often the time in between the temples which is the most authentic. It's the journey rather than the destinations. I didn't really experience that so much because I was in a car. It was something I would love to do again someday and actually walk the whole thing. It really was a good, fun thing to do on my 50th birthday.
My shakuhachi teacher did it last year. It took her and her partner about 2 months.
Yes,
she had the white robe or whatever, the hat, the staff, and she would play a bit of shakuhachi in each temple. It was quite an experience. I saw some of the photos from it. It was actually quite something. So were you lugging around? So you shoot Hasselblads, you shoot film. Were you lugging around a lot of cameras and lenses when you were doing this? I guess that's an excuse to do it by car.
Yes, it would be quite a trek, I must say, carrying my pack around. I've always believed that I should photograph with what I can carry, but I do use medium format cameras, and they are, they're analog, they're film, they're pretty heavy. So yes, 2 camera bodies, 5 lenses, tripod, all this sort of stuff. It's quite weighty. So yes,
That's
I did
a lot.
in the car, and I would lug it up all the steps to the mountain places, but I could do it in those days. Now I have a new. Did I tell you about my new knee?
Yeah, you told me that you got a knee replacement, and you used to be a long distance runner, right? And so,
exactly. 7 marathons. To my credit.
You've done marathons, you've done a lot of walking, and now you have titanium in your leg.
Now.
How's it going?
It's 5 weeks out. Still very painful. Still hobbling around, but it'll get better, I'm sure.
So, do you think you'll be able to go back to climbing the mountains like you used to do?
Apparently so. Yes.
Okay.
I don't think I can get back to running because it's too impact on the knee, the artificial knee. But I can certainly bicycle and row and a lot of other things.
Great. Technology is wonderful. Do photographers who get knee replacements think about the gear that they're getting? It's like one knee replacement better than another. This one's sharper. This one's smoother.
Yeah. I've never been one of those photographers anyway. I've used the same equipment I've used since the mid-'80s. I don't even know what new equipment there is.
Have you even replaced your camera bodies or not?
Occasionally, if
other than things that get damaged or lost.
Yeah, I'll just get another one. I've dropped them in oceans before, and they've got completely waterlogged, and things they fall off the tripod occasionally, and so yes, I have.
That's interesting because too many photographers, especially amateurs like us, get all obsessed about the gear, thinking, "Oh yes, it's a good camera that's going to make good photos." And I'll just remind people listening that you did a wonderful book of photos shot with a Holga.
Quite right. Yes, yeah. So what is it? $25 camera.
Yeah, if even that, and some cheap 120 film, and you can do wonderful things.
Yeah.
In fact, there are a lot of bird photos with the Holga. I guess because it's lighter, it's easier to move when you see the birds flying by.
Yes, with a tripod, that is one of the downsides for me, is that most times I use it on a tripod. Just because I like long exposures, I like depth of field, I often use long lenses, all this sort of stuff, and handheld. For example, I was recently I photographed in in Laos on a boat, so it was all handheld. And recently somebody asked, "Well, can you make a big print of that?" I said, "No, it's impossible. It's too much camera shake. It won't work. Small print works extremely well."
Yeah.
But
So I have a question about technique, because obviously you went to art school and then you worked as a printer. And how long did it take before you just ignored the technique, in the sense that the camera becomes your eye?
I can't quantify it, but I think it's with any skill level that you need to be able to have the technique down to the point where you don't even think about it. And then you can be... Yeah. If you're a musician, for example, or, a pianist, you study the piano for 10 years to the point where you can imagine music and you can create it. And it's the same with photography. And the more time you're spending fiddling around, working out how something is working, you're missing what's going on outside. It needs to be an extension of your body, of your mind, of your soul. Just, you need to be creative with it. And you can't really do that if you're constantly figuring out how to do something, I don't think, anyway.
But you said you keep 5 lenses. You carry 5 lenses with you.
I do.
What sort of focal lengths? Is this getting everything from ultra wide to ultra telephoto?
It's 2 1/4, so it goes from, I think, 40 millimeter to 250, and it just goes along.
Yeah.
Sometimes I also carry one of these converters that makes the 250 500 if I'm desperate.
Right.
Don't use all.
Is Hasselblad not a system where you have zoom lenses that you could replace some of those with, or you just not like zooms?
I don't think they ever made a zoom lens for them.
Oh, really? Okay.
At the time they got to digital stuff, they did, but I don't think with these older lenses.
So I remember when I was shooting film on an Olympus, zoom lenses were available, but I don't remember much about that back in the day.
Yeah, I understand very little about the technology and technique of photography.
I find that really interesting because on the one hand, you're a master printer, so you've got everything down in the darkroom, all the chemicals and the length of time and everything. But on the camera side, it doesn't really matter that much as long as you've got the good quality that you want in the medium format.
It's a bit like, I have a guitar over there. It's a guitar with 6 strings. It doesn't change much. There's all sorts of different guitars, but if you learn to play a basic guitar, you know how to play the guitar. You don't have to have all this elaborate stuff around it. The camera equipment for me is exactly the same. It's very simple equipment. It should be, at least for me, it should be very simple equipment.
Film cameras are simple.
Yeah.
They don't have a lot of complicated things. They've got a shutter that opens and closes. You got a thing to advance the film, and you put a lens on.
Yes, yeah. But at the same time, I'm out here, and my brother-in-law's here, and my cousins here, and they have these cameras which they can attach to telescopes, and they revolve around and plot with the crosshairs and do these amazing 8-hour exposures of the solar system and Milky Ways and all sorts of exquisite things, which is beyond me with my simple film camera. So I think we just make choices as we go along as to what we want to do and how we want to do it, and I'm very content with this old traditional film format that takes me forever to actually come out with an image many months later, or now 40 years later I'm printing images and looking at the negatives saying, I didn't fix that very well. It's kind of showing signs of age.
Well, I remember last year you told me that you really like the surprise that comes when you develop a roll of film that you shot a couple of months ago and you didn't remember exactly all the images, and that's very different than the immediacy of digital.
That's a basic principle that I've applied to my work for many years now. Is the idea of avoiding pre-visualization. I kind of work against that. I try to forget immediately what I photographed. And I don't have any reference. Sometimes in the past I used to take Polaroids, which is basically a reference to where the place was. Now I can use my, my phone and take a snap so I know where it was. But I love to forget what I've just done. And then I can see freshly again, what else is there? How do I do this? How do I approach this? What other position can I be? If it's a long exposure, a short, f-stop or whatever. There's infinite variations to photograph anything. And I find that that forgetfulness is a great asset for me in terms of if I'm moving around, it's because I'm doing my knee here. Sorry, you can cut it out. It's fine.
I heard it creaking. Yes.
So yes, and once I photographed, then the film is processed in labs, in Tokyo, London, New York, Seattle, various. I don't process my own film because I find it intensely boring. I don't even know what chemicals they use, and that's absolutely fine with me. And then I eventually get the contact sheets back, or the negatives, and I make contact sheets. And sometimes that can be many months later. And it's just like Christmas. I'm opening presents and I'm seeing things completely afresh, objectively. I don't really remember all the associations at the time. And so I can see these images and respond to almost neutrally, like it's somebody else's images.
Well, that brings up a question for me about intention, because part of the thing that I was wondering as we were coming into this was, when you were shooting these Buddhas, did you ever have the idea of, oh, well, maybe this will be a project or a book, or, will this contribute to maybe some sort of theme later on, versus just being in the moment, this is where I am, and I'm just shooting. And it sounds to me as if it's even more in the moment, because you're taking a shot and then forgetting what you did and taking another shot.
Yeah, the mindset, it varies across the board. Sometimes I'm working on specific commissions, specific projects. We're working on a book or an exhibition, or other times I'm just photographing. Sometimes I'm almost photographing in spite of myself, because I am trying to experience the moment. I mean, some of the Shikoku pilgrimage was, I kept thinking, well, maybe I shouldn't even photograph. I should just be here. But then I was thinking also, well, but I should, be here and record what I see here. And I always feel that every time we encounter a person, subject matter, whatever it is, it's absolutely unique. Never, ever happen again. Even if you return in 6 months, 5 years' time, it's never going to be the same. And so there's a certain responsibility, if you're a photographer, to photograph. I'm a trained photographer. I've been doing it for all these years. And I should photograph. I remember when I first started a project on concentration camps in Europe. In the late 80s. And, I was almost ashamed of what I was doing. I was like, why am I interested in concentration camps? I just don't understand this. And at the same time, I had to override this sense of, you shouldn't be photographing here. You should be paying respect. And I kept thinking, well, if I was a victim, if I was a survivor, I would want this recorded. I would want somebody who's in the right place, the right person, at the right time, to make the most of it, to capture what they see. And I did this for a number of years, and I couldn't quite understand why. And eventually I came to the decision and conclusion that, if I just give all this stuff away, which I eventually did, it releases me completely. I'm not taking any advantage of the situation. I'm not profiting. It's a collaboration with subject matter. But I didn't realize at the beginning what I was doing. I didn't photograph towards a project. I photographed because I was there and I felt I should photograph. Mm-hmm. And then I continued photographing for 10 years and I gave everything away. And it felt great. That was the way it should be.
Yeah.
So the project defines itself as you do the process.
Sometimes. And other times you have a specific project. The River Po, which is another book that's coming out this fall that I've just finished, just printed. It's not even been laid out yet. The first layout I just saw yesterday. It's for a project in northern Italy. I encountered this river back in 2007. I photographed around the area. It's like meeting a person. There was an attraction, there was a affiliation, there was an association, there was a feeling that, I want to meet this person again, or I want to meet this river again. So I went back, in 2008. I had 4 or 5 photographs from the river. And then it took me another 10 years, 12 years, and thought, I'd like to revisit this place, which is often what you do with photography. For me, it's a matter of saying, I wonder what's changed. I've changed, was Heraclitus quote about the river is never the same as the person is never the same.
You can't step into the same river twice.
Exactly, yes. So for me, it's like that in photography. It's everything is always slightly bit different, and I never quite know ahead of time what I'm going to be doing next year. So I went back to the River Po, and I don't know, a few years ago, and then I said, yeah, I'm going to trace this river from start to finish. From the mountains to the delta, which is what I did. I got on board a local photography organization to help guide me. Then I met various people who took me to different places and kind of knew the area. And I did it over 2 or 3 years. I photographed, and now it's it's a book of 100 images. It's a project that, when I first started, it wasn't a project. It was it was a conversation. It was a meeting, and the conversation later developed into a relationship. Relationship developed into something a little more serious, which is now will come out in a book and an exhibition in the fall.
And yet there are other projects that you go into them already knowing that you have a limited time, like when you went to Mont Saint-Michel.
Right.
You got access at night, and these are extraordinary photos because they're long exposures, because it's empty. Mont Saint-Michel empty. No one sees it empty. Yeah. I've only been there a couple times. I used to live a couple hours from there.
Yes.
And even off-season, it's just so crowded.
But again, that was based upon going to Mont Saint-Michel. How many years before? I don't know how many years. I mean, I'd been to Mont Saint-Michel 2 or 3 times before. I'd made photographs. It's very touristy. It's like, it's interesting, but it's not that interesting. And then coming back and say, oh, those are interesting photographs. I should revisit. And then going back and then.
Oh, I see.
Then, it's a bit like the Buddhist thing. And then saying, in some ways, how do I gain access? But how do I form a connection? And so I was able to form a connection with the Benedictine order of monks. And I stayed with them, for 4 or 5 days at a time in complete silence, which is my perfect bliss.
Uh-huh.
And, I had to go to all the rituals, like, if I would go to Koyasan and I do the Buddhist rituals. So I go to all the rituals and I had carte blanche. They'd let me wander around anywhere I wanted, basically. And so I could photograph in the middle of the night when there was nobody around. So it became a project, but it wasn't a project at the beginning.
So when you were young, you were going to become a priest, and you changed your mind. And how does this inform the way you're approaching things? Like you just said at Mont Saint-Michel, taking part in the rituals, wanting that silence and peace when you're doing your photography.
I did. When I was growing up, when I was 8 or 9, I was an altar boy at the local Catholic church. I just loved being in the churches. I loved all the rituals, the importance, the kind of ceremonial aspect, just the atmosphere. I would spend hours in the church on my own, just sitting there, praying, listening, absorbing. And I decided that I wanted to become a priest. And I was accepted into a seminary school, and I spent 7 years there. So I learned a lot about discipline, silence, ritual, prayer, all of this sort of stuff. A certain point, probably puberty, I decided, maybe not such a good idea.
Yeah, there are some vows that aren't necessarily great there.
Right. But, I have absolutely no regrets about that education. It took me away from my, industrial, urban education, and put me into a different place where the priests were teaching. But all these priests, they had PhDs and, MSCs and MAs, and, they were highly educated. And I received a very, very good education as a result. And it kind of trained me in many ways for my photographic life, in terms of the discipline it takes. We'd have, 3-day retreats of complete silence, or we'd have prayer every day or mass for an hour and a half, be on our knees and silence. And there's a certain amount of discipline that you almost, if you grow up with, it becomes normalized to a degree. So when I go, visit the monks or the Buddhist temples, it feels completely natural and normal to me to enjoy and participate in their rituals. And it feels completely fine to me when somebody says, well, what do you do for those 5 hours when you're doing a night exposure? So, well, what a luxury to do nothing for 5 hours, to not have to do anything for 5 hours, just to watch the stars, the moon.
But do you really do nothing? Do you not read, listen to music, nap?
I just walk. Sometimes I nap if I'm tired, but if it's an hour exposure or whatever, I'll just hang around and explore. Or sometimes I set up a tripod and then I wander off to another place to find out where I'm going to do the next photograph. But it's not. No, I don't plug myself in electronically very much.
Yeah. One last thing I wanted to ask, and you're known for not taking pictures of people, with the exception of your book Rafu, which was photos of nudes that you've shot in Japan, which came out a year or 2 years ago.
Yes.
You generally don't have people in your photos. When you were shooting some of these Buddha photos, they look to me, and so since you've got the book handy, pages 124 and 125, you've got 2 photos from the Musée Guimet, which look to me like classic portraits.
Yes.
How much time did you spend on the lighting for that?
0. I don't light.
You really just took the natural light in the museum?
Photograph whatever. That's what I do.
Okay.
Yeah, I use whatever light there is.
Because the one on page 125, the lighting is striking. It almost looks to me like it was crafted to really get those shadows.
I'm sure these museums choreograph their lighting very well. I don't.
Yeah.
I need to be to do that.
Well, most museums have too much light, though.
Musée Guimet is particularly good, and I would go on the off days too. So maybe they wouldn't have the main lighting on. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I could do. I mean, because I can do exposures for as long as it's necessary.
Yeah. But did you approach these as just photos of objects, or did you think of them as representations of people and consider that? In other words, try to make them portraits of people at the same time?
Well, yes, they are people. I mean, they represent the Buddha. But I approach it, I suppose, very much in the same way as I'd photograph a tree, for example, which we don't regard as a person, but I still regard it as a portrait. It's a portrait of a living organism. And I try to photograph most things with a certain amount of respect. So if I was going to make a portrait of anybody, I would try to do it in the best way that I possibly could.
Michael, I want to thank you very much. This is a fascinating book. I recommend it to anyone, whether or not they're interested in Buddhism or statues of the Buddha. I guess there's about 20 non-statue photos throughout, maybe even a little bit more. Landscapes, trees. What I really like in the statues is that some of them you've got the full statue, some it's just the face, some just a small detail. It's quite a stunning way to approach a subject, and all the more interesting that you didn't go into it thinking, I have to check all these boxes to get these photos all different. But how many photos of Buddhas do you have altogether that you chose from to make this book? I know on your website there's quite a lot.
Probably 200 or 300. I mean, I have many that I haven't even printed yet. I just, there's always a time aspect to silver gelatin printing. It's not as if you can't scan 300 or 400 prints at a time. You have to spend many hours printing each one. So the ones on the website are the ones that I've printed so far.
Right.
There are many more. But just going back to what you were saying about the aspect of the book, in some ways for me, I didn't actively paginate it in this way, but in a sense, it's the way that we would behave if we went to one of these places. So we see the landscape, we see the overall, we see the Buddha statue in whole. We concentrate on certain aspects. Our gaze moves around. We perhaps see the flowers or the candles or the incense, or we embrace what is there. And that's, as I said, I didn't paginate this book, and so it's wonderful for me to have somebody else do it in such a sensitive manner.
Oh, you didn't do that at all? Okay.
Oh, which is great. And sometimes,
well, it's great if you like it, but then if you disagree, it's not so great, right?
Well, I mean, if you can have a dialogue, and if it's not, I did have some input later on. I didn't like some areas and some full bleeds I don't like on pages, and I had to make things and change things around and so. But basically, it's somebody else's pagination, and I having been doing this for so long, and I have 70 odd books published at this point, many of which I've paginated myself. I fully acknowledge and I'm conscious that I do things in a certain way. My head kind of controls me to a degree, and it's becoming a little predictable, and I know it is.
Yeah.
Paginated, but I know the way I'm doing it, and I try to do it differently, and I go back to a certain models of understanding and progression that fit well with me. But it's wonderful to have somebody else come in who thinks differently, sees differently, and can move things around. And it's, it's incumbent upon me, supposedly the artist, to be able to accept that I don't know it all. I'm just a part of the equation.
And that sometimes other people see connections in across photos that you don't even notice because you've seen them so many times.
Absolutely, which is, for me, wonderful.
Okay, Michael, thank you very much. I hope your knee gets better and you can get back to running or bicycling or whatever soon.
I hope so, too. I'm going to be skiing soon, even though I couldn't before. No, I'm...
So, Jeff, have you got a snapshot this week?
I do have a snapshot that has nothing to do with anything we've been talking about, because that's just how these work sometimes. My snapshot is a little substance called Sugru, S-U-G-R-U. And what it is this came up recently. It's basically it's like clay that you can mold into a shape, and then when it dries, it basically becomes like rubber. And you're like, okay, why are we talking about this? Well, when you have things like electronics and power that we all deal with, sometimes they get frayed, sometimes they get, scraped up or whatever. In this case, my wife's laptop, the power cord had gotten worn. And so, it's one thing to replace, say, an iPhone cord, but to actually have to replace the power brick for a MacBook Pro, it's just blah. So a little dab of this, it comes in a sealed pouch, you work it with your fingers, you put it where you want it, and then after 24 hours, it's dried and basically fixes that spot. Now, I also bring this up in a photographic way because when I had my Fuji X-T1 that I had gotten from a friend, the first models of the X-T1, the buttons were really pretty flush on the back. And so he had used a little bit of Sugru to just basically put on top of the buttons to make them a lot more tactile. So it's a type of thing where it's sort of like a Sawzall. Once you have one, you start looking for other reasons to use it. Pressure washers are the same way. It's like, all right, what can I pressure wash next? And so it's just this very handy little substance that can fix a lot of things, and especially in photographic situations, there are just lots of different uses. So Sugru, that's mine for today. What do you have today?
I've got an app. It's called Meta Image, METAIMAGE. Meta Image is an EXIF data editor. EXIF data is the metadata that your camera writes to your photo files, and it contains things like the name of the camera model, the date and time, the GPS, the aperture, f-stop, ISO, all that information. And we've talked in other episodes about how I don't really care that much about the settings that I've used, but sometimes there are things you want to find out. Maybe you want to look at what lens you use for a certain camera. Maybe you want to find, for example, and I'm looking at a photo I shot here, which is the focus pixel. So Fuji cameras record the focus pixel, which is the precise pixel where it focused a shot. Maybe you want to see the film simulation, or did you use the electronic shutter or not? All sorts of data gets written into digital photo files. Now, if you look in most photo editors, you can see some of that data, but what Meta Image does is gives you the complete EXIF data. Plus, if you go into the preferences, you can choose specific camera brands, Apple, Canon, Fuji, Kodak, Leica, etc., and you can add a set of tags for those cameras. So I have EXIF data. It also shows IPTC, XMP, and ICC, which are other types of metadata, and I have a little tab for Fujifilm EXIF data. So I can look at the specific data that Fujifilm cameras write into the photos. Now, I don't really need this often. I'm not obsessed about this sort of thing, but every once in a while I do want to look at this. And this is a really useful tool for this. It'll show you your location on a map if GPS is recorded. It shows a thumbnail. And you can edit any of these. Well, you can edit most of the fields. Some of them you can't edit. Some of them you can where you might not want to. Like, for instance, I'm looking at a photo with shadows and highlights. It shows the setting I had when I took the photo. I could edit this if I want, but I don't really want to. So it's called Meta Image. I think it's $17.99 on the Mac App Store.
More data. More data is always good.
I think just after talking with Michael Kenna, sometimes you don't need the data. Sometimes you just need the picture. And I really like the way he just like waits for months before he looks at his photos.
Yes. Maybe we should try that. Just take some photos and then forget about them for, oh, wait a minute, that's a big portion of my library.
Okay, that's enough for this week, Jeff. See you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening to PhotoActive. You can find show notes, including any photos we discuss in this episode, at photoactive.co. That's photoactive.co. We couldn't afford the M. You can join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/photoactivecast. That's PhotoActiveCast in one word. You can subscribe to PhotoActive in your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts. See the links on our website. And think about leaving us a rating or review in iTunes or in your podcast app.